Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The summer of 1955 echoed with the laughter of children in the hot streets of Chicago, fading away between buildings that shone under the sun. 14-year-old Emmett Till was at his mother, Mamie's house, feeling the excitement of the day he would leave for Mississippi. Born and raised in Chicago, Emmett was a cheerful, energetic, and playful child. After finishing his breakfast, he leaned against his mother's lap and looked at her with bright eyes. "Mom, what's Mississippi like? Is it like here?" he asked. Deep sense of worry filled Mamie Till's heart. Like every mother who wants to keep her child safe, she had to explain how he should behave in Mississippi. "No, Emmett, it's not like Chicago," she said. While Chicago was difficult for African Americans, it was freer compared to Mississippi. In the South, strict racial segregation laws were still in place. Black people could not enter the same restaurants as whites, drink from the same water fountains, and even accidentally disrespecting a white person could result in death. Mamie was sure Emmett was unaware of this. Her son was innocent, curious, and looked at the world with hope. But the South would not forgive children like him. As Mamie packed a few clothes into her son's suitcase, she took a deep breath and held Emmett's hands. "Look, son, you have to be careful there. You have to act differently around white people. Don't make eye contact, be respectful, and never raise your voice. Remember, this is not Chicago." Emmett listened to his mother's words, but he didn't fully understand their weight. He was just going on a summer vacation. He would spend time with his cousins, run through the fields, and sit on the porch at night telling stories. To him, this trip seemed more like an adventure than a danger. A few hours later, when they arrived at the train station, Mamie hugged her son and gave him one last warning. "No matter what happens, you have to come back safe." Emmett noticed the worry on his mother's face, but didn't make too much of it. He boarded the train and waved to her from the window. Mamie, trying to hold back tears, watched the silhouette of her son fade away. She felt uneasy inside, as if she sensed that this goodbye might be the last dot. As the train departed from Chicago's crowded station, Emmett looked around at the other black passengers sitting next to him. Everyone headed to Mississippi seemed serious. Many had their heads down, lost in their thoughts as the train left Chicago. The atmosphere began to change. As they passed the Illinois border and neared the South, the rules on the train changed as well. Due to Jim Crow laws, black passengers had to sit apart from white passengers. In one of the train's designated cars, black passengers sat quietly, looking at each other in silence, watching the world outside. Emmett noticed this, but couldn't fully grasp how serious it was. When they arrived in Mississippi, he was greeted by his grandmother and cousins. The air was hot and humid. Fields stretched out, and old wooden houses lined the road. As Emmett walked with his cousins to the house, he noticed his grandmother's tired face. The old woman had lived in these lands for years, and she knew very well what it meant to be a black child there that night. As the family sat on the porch reminiscing about old times, Emmett laughed and told stories joyfully. His grandmother and cousins were a little worried about how relaxed he was. They knew a black child had to be cautious there, but Emmett wasn't aware of the world he had stepped into that night. While the stars shone over Mississippi, Emmett's fate had already been sealed. What should have been an ordinary summer vacation for him would soon turn into a tragedy that would be etched in history. The suffocating heat of Mississippi gave way to a light breeze by late afternoon. Emmett and his cousins had spent the day in the fields drenched in sweat. They were all thirsty and decided to head to Bryant's Grocery, one of the small shops in the town, to grab a cold drink. The grocery store was small but busy. It was usually where black workers from the cotton fields stopped to buy something. However, the owners of the store were white. Roy Bryant and his wife Caroline Bryant were the owners and operators. Roy wasn't at the store that day, so it was only 21-year-old Caroline. Inside, the door creaked open. Emmett and his friends noticed there were very few customers inside. Emmett glanced at the candy on the counter while looking for a cold drink on the shelves. For Emmett, who had grown up in Chicago, such stores were ordinary. In the big city, people didn't pay much attention to each other, but things were different in Mississippi. Caroline Bryant stood behind the counter, silently observing the entrance of the black children. Back then, in the South, it was even frowned upon for black people to speak directly to white people. However, Emmett didn't fully understand these strict rules. He was a cheerful and confident child. Emmett pulled out his money and walked up to Caroline's counter. According to rumors, at that moment he joked with her by saying, "Hey baby." Some say he simply thanked her, while others claim he whistled. However, no matter which version is true, addressing a white woman like that, or speaking casually with her, in Mississippi at that time was a huge risk for a black person. Carolyn gave the young boy a quick look, her eyes widening. She paused for a moment, then quickly walked out. She seemed unsure of what to do, but it was clear from the expression on her face that she was uncomfortable. When Caroline stepped outside, Emmett's cousins immediately realized what had happened. What might have seemed like a simple event to the townspeople was understood by his cousins as something far more serious. In this town, a black person flirting with a white woman was unforgivable. "Emmett, what do you think you're doing?" one of his cousins whispered. "You can't talk like that here." But Emmett didn't understand what was so wrong. Growing up in Chicago, he never thought that such behavior would be a big crime. "What do you mean?" "I was just joking," he said nonchalantly. But in Mississippi, things didn't work that way. The children quickly left the store. Caroline Bryant was standing outside, looking around angrily, as though she was thinking about something. Her behavior was a threat to the white men in the town. In the South at that time, disturbing a white woman could cost a black person their life. Caroline quickly returned to the store and began planning to inform her husband. Emmett and his friends, however, didn't seem to take the situation too seriously. But his grandmother and uncles knew very well what could happen when the news spread that evening. Emmett sat on the porch, laughing and joking with his cousins. He still didn't see the events as a big deal. But soon, rumors began to spread among the townspeople. Two white men, enraged by what had happened, had already decided to take revenge. Emmett, unaware that his fate was about to change, went about his night. It was late at night. In the rural areas of Mississippi, the moonlight cast a pale glow over the earth. Despite the suffocating heat of summer, the stillness of the night felt unsettling, as though something was wrong. Emmett's grandfather's wooden house disappeared into the shadows of the dark night. Everyone inside had fallen asleep, weary from the day. But this peace would soon give way to fear. It was just past midnight. Grandfather Moses Wright, despite his age, was still a strong man. That night, while resting half awake in his bed, he was startled by the sound of an engine outside. He could feel that the visitors didn't come with good intentions. Then, a loud knock sounded on the door. Bam, bam, bam. Everyone in the house suddenly woke up. The children huddled together in fear. Grandfather Moses got out of bed, his voice trembling as he called out from behind the door, "Who's there?" The voice from outside was deep and harsh. "You know who we are. We want the boy," Moses writes. Heart started to race. He realized that this was the moment he had feared from the very beginning. The men outside were Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, Caroline Bryant's husband and his ruthless cousin. They were white men. It was clear from their threatening tone that they were armed. "The boy is just a child. Please, if he made a mistake, forgive him for his youth." Bryant's voice was sharp and cold. "There is no forgiveness for flirting with a white woman. Bring the boy out." Emmett is called inside at that moment. Emmett had gotten out of bed, trying to understand what was happening at the door. His cousins and grandmother were looking at him with concern. One of his cousins whispered, "Hide." But Emmett, with the innocence of someone raised in Chicago, still didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. Moses, helpless, turned back inside and looked at his grandson. "Son, I think they want to see you." Emmett swallowed but tried to hide his fear. As he stepped out of the room, he remembered his mother's words. "No matter what happens, you must come back home safely." When he opened the door, two white men were standing in front of him. Bryant and Millam's faces were expressionless, but their eyes were filled with anger. Millam was holding a large weapon, pointing it at Emmett. "It would be best if we didn't do this. We're just going to take him for a little ride." Without hesitation, Millam grabbed Emmett, yanking him by the arm and dragging him outside. His grandmother started crying, and his cousins were breathless. "Let the boy go," they begged, but the men ignored them. "Stay out of this, or there'll be one less person in this house," Millam threatened. As Emmett stepped outside, he felt the coldness of the night. A truck was parked in front of them. Its headlights were on, and there were a few people in the back, their silhouettes barely visible. They were also white men. Millam tossed Emmett into the back of the truck. The boy lost his balance and fell harshly onto the ground. The cold metal of the truck bed hit him. As Emmett tried to get up, he saw a pair of shoes. When he looked up, he noticed another man inside. His face was filled with hatred. Grandfather Moses watched helplessly as his grandson was taken away. "Please, don't hurt him," he said with a trembling voice. Bryant shot him a cold look. "I can't promise you that." Then, the truck door slammed shut. The roar of the engine pierced the night silence. As the vehicle slowly drove away, Moses Wright and his family were left standing there. Motionless, Emmett was being taken into the unknown darkness of the night, and his fate was now in their hands. As the truck's engine hummed through the night, Emmett struggled to hold onto the hard metal surface. The bumpy road shook the truck, and with each bump, his body collided with the metal bed. He tried to push himself up with his hands, but failed. He could feel eyes on him. One of the men inside was watching him, and there was no pity or compassion. In his gaze, only anger and hatred. When the truck finally stopped, Emmett heard the silence outside. Where were they now? 1,000 questions raced through his mind, but he didn't have any answers. Then, the back of the truck was opened. With a loud bang, "Get down, N*********, Millam shouted. Emmett tried to crawl up on his knees. Before he knew what was happening, Millam grabbed him by the neck and yanked him down. The young boy lost his balance and fell, his knees hitting the hard ground. In that moment, he felt the first blow. Millam raised a thick stick and brought it down on Emmett's back. "How dare you look at a white woman like that?" The second blow. "How dare you talk to her?" The third blow. Emmett, trying to control his breath, lifted his head. Millam and Bryant were leaning over him in the darkness, their faces full of rage. Millam dropped the stick and pulled out a gun from his waistband. He pressed the cold metal barrel against Emmett's forehead. "Tell us the truth. What did you say to the woman?" Emmett's voice trembled, but he tried to stay strong. "I was just talking. I didn't do anything wrong." This response made Millam even angrier. He lowered the gun and punched Emmett hard in the face. The boy's head jerked to the side, and blood trickled from his teeth. But Emmett didn't cry. He didn't scream. "Do you think you're some kind of idiot, huh?" Bryant spat on the ground and grabbed Emmett by the collar, forcing him to stand. "Do you know what it means for an******* R to talk to a white woman around here?" Emmett closed his eyes. He didn't answer. The men dragged him. An abandoned barn. The doors creaked open, and a musty smell filled the air. The wooden walls were darkened by moisture, and rusty metal scraps, chains, and old farming tools littered the floor. Milam shoved Emmett inside roughly. The young boy collapsed face first onto the ground. Then the two men entered, shutting the door behind them. Inside, only the flickering light of a gas lamp illuminated the scene, and the torture began. First came the punches. Bryant and Milam took turns, hitting the boy in the face, stomach, and back over and over again. Each blow caused the young body to collapse a little more. Each punch added more pain to his flesh. After a while, Milam raised the butt of his gun and brought it down on Emmett's head. The child fell to the ground with a harsh grunt, but he was still alive. Milam paused, out of breath. Damn it, he's still not passed out. Bryant knelt down and lifted Emmett's bloodied face. One of his eyes was shut. His lips were split. Bryant looked at him with disgust. You still call this a child? He's no different than a man. Milam shook his head. Then he should die like a man. After hours of torture, Emmett could no longer move. The men dragged his unconscious body and tossed it back into the truck bed. Along the way, his body slammed against the metal of the bed, and with every bump, he felt new pains. But he no longer had the strength to scream. When the truck reached the Tallahatchie River, it stopped. Things grew even darker here. Bryant and Milam took one of the heavy propellers from a cotton gin and tied it around Emmett's neck. This metal piece, weighing over 100 pounds, would be enough to drag the child's lifeless body to the bottom of the river. Milam calmly nodded as he looked at the river. It's over. When Bryant and Milam threw Emmett's body into the water, bloodstains spread across the surface for a while. Then, the weight of the cotton gin propeller dragged him deep into the water. The river slowly took in the traces of the violence. That night, an innocent child, simply because of the color of his skin, became the victim of one of the most brutal murders in history. But this story was not going to end here, because soon the name Emmett Till would turn into a cry that would echo across America forever. The Tallahatchie River kept its secret for 3 days. The surface of the water occasionally rippled, and the reeds swayed silently. The river, a silent witness to that terrible night, had taken a child's innocence and buried it in its depths. But the river could not remain silent forever. On the 3rd day, a man fishing by the river noticed something strange floating on the surface of the water. At first, he thought it was a log, but as he got closer, he realized it was a human body. The man looked at the body, which was struggling to rise from the riverbed with fear. Emmett's body had swollen in the water. His face was unrecognizable due to the blows he had received. One of his eyes was bulging. His head was cracked open. The heavy metal piece attached to his neck prevented him from fully rising to the surface, but his body was slightly lifted. By the buoyancy of the water, the fisherman's eyes widened in horror. For a moment, he considered ignoring the body. The murder of a black child in Mississippi wasn't an uncommon thing, but this was not an ordinary murder. The nearest sheriff's office was quickly notified. Within a short time, local authorities arrived at the scene. When the body was pulled from the water, everyone who saw it was horrified. This wasn't just a murder. This was the extreme point of brutality and hatred. In Chicago, Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, had been praying for days that her son, whom she had not heard from, would return home safely. But deep down, she was afraid. She could feel that something bad had happened, too. Emmett, finally, when the phone call came from Mississippi, her world shattered. We found your son's body. It's in very bad condition. Mrs. Till Mamie's heart almost stopped. The voice on the other end of the line tried to choose its words carefully, but none of them could lessen the pain. Send me my son's body. The authorities hesitated. Mrs. Till, you don't want to see the body. Mamie's voice was firm. That is my son. You will send it. A few days later, a casket was unloaded from a train at the train station in Chicago. It had the words "Do not open" written in large letters on it, but Mamie Till was going to open that casket. When Mamie Till entered the funeral home, she had trouble standing. The fear inside her was making her legs heavy. She had been prepared for the worst-case scenarios all her life. But this was a moment that no mother could ever be prepared for. Before long, the funeral home attendants opened the casket and Mamie's knees gave way. She thought she was ready to see the body pulled from the river. But seeing her son like this was something no mother could bear. Emmett's face had completely changed from the blows he had received. One of his eyes was shattered, his teeth were broken, and his jaw was dislocated. His body bore the marks of every detail of the torture. The heavy metal chain mark still remained on his neck. Mamie could only stare for a while. Tears ran down her cheeks, but even crying wasn't enough in that moment. It was a pain that burned deep within. Then she whispered, "How could they do this to my son?" Her relatives tried to calm her down. "Mrs. Till, maybe we should keep the casket closed. You wouldn't want to remember your son like this." But Mamie had made her decision. "No," she said in a strong voice. "This casket will stay open." They turned to her in shock. There was anger and determination in Mamie's eyes. "The world needs to see what happened to my son." On the day of the funeral, when the doors of the church in Chicago opened, thousands of people gathered to accompany Emmett on his final journey. Everyone was silent, but their eyes were filled with sorrow and anger. Those who saw Emmett in the casket first held their breath, then broke into tears. People were trying to understand how such brutality could happen. Journalists raised their cameras and pressed the shutters, and soon the horrific images of Emmett Till would spread across America. Mamie Till stood tall by her son's side. She had to be strong. She wouldn't let her son's death be forgotten. "I had to see my son like this. Now you look, and stand up so this never happens again." At that moment, America awoke. Emmett Till's death would become one of the biggest sparks of the civil rights movement. But in a mother's heart, no movement, no justice could ever erase that pain. She was no longer burying a child, but a symbol. In September 1955, a small courthouse in Mississippi was hosting a trial that would determine the fate of the country. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, who were held responsible for the horrific murder of Emmett Till, were brought to trial. However, this trial seemed to have been convened not to deliver justice, but to complete a formality. The defendants' lawyers were doing everything they could to influence the jury. In the courtroom, they were trying to spread the idea that Emmett Till needed to be disciplined. According to them, Emmett had misbehaved with a white woman and was a Northerner who didn't know the rules of the South. The prosecutor had evidence. Witnesses had testified about how Milam and Bryant had forcefully taken Emmett. However, in the courtroom, there was a system determined to maintain the superiority of whites over blacks. The all-white jury deliberated for only 1 hour before finding the defendants innocent. In fact, one of the jury members would later say, "We could have reached our decision even faster, but we wanted to take a break." And then the judge announced the verdict. The defendants are not guilty. The white people in the courtroom greeted the verdict with joy. Bryant and Milam's faces showed the relief of those who had won. But for Mamie Till and her supporters, this was not just a court decision. It was proof of America's injustice. A few months after the trial, Look magazine conducted an exclusive interview with Bryant and Milam. Since they had been acquitted, they could no longer be punished. And in the interview, they confessed to what they had done without flinching. "Yes, we killed that nigga." Milam spoke coldly. "If we hadn't killed him, everyone in the South would have laughed at us." In their eyes, Emmett's life meant nothing. This confession shocked America. A non-white child had been brutally murdered just for allegedly whistling at a white woman. The killers, after being acquitted in court, proudly admitted to committing the crime, and nothing happened to them. The trial may have been over, but Mamie Till's fight was just beginning. She would not let her son's death be forgotten. As a mother, she didn't just mourn. She decided to fight against her son's killing. She spoke at rallies in Chicago and across the country, calling on people to stand up for justice. Mamie's courage inspired the civil rights movement. Death led to Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on the bus. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X never forgot. Emmett's case. America would never be the same again. Years later, Emmett Till's name became one of the symbols of the civil rights struggle. Books were written in his name, and documentaries were made. The murder case was reopened in 2004, but once again, no one was tried, however. The world had changed. Emmett's death was one of the events that led to the end of the Jim Crow laws. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and racial segregation was banned. But Mamie Till continued to fight for her son's justice throughout her life. And she repeated these words at every opportunity. "My son is dead, but his death will not be in vain." And indeed it wasn't. Emmett Till is still remembered as one of the symbols of justice.